Everybody, welcome to the first of 3 videos for Age of Sigmar week. If you don't know, Age of Sigmar is my favorite game, and today we're going to talk about lore. And if you're following in real time, I'll have playlist links below, but tomorrow we'll be talking about the books, and then the final video will be talking about actually the Soulbound RPG. So it's a very theme-heavy week here in this case. I've done reviews and battle reports and stuff like that in the past. I'll have some links to that down below as well. But I thought, let me try to dive into this game from another angle. So today we're going to talk about the lore. And the lore is something that Age of Sigmar gets a lot of guff for. So I'm going to list my top 5 favorite things about Age of Sigmar lore. And they're kind of broad and generic, so I'm going to try to focus them back in. But there are going to kind of be some tentacles here on some of these different topics. And the first one, my number 5, is actually going to be the realms. So if you don't know, Age of Sigmar is made up of 8 realms plus kind of like a realm of chaos. And each realm is sort of has an affinity to a certain type of magic or a certain type of element. So you've got the realm of light, Haish, or the realm of death, Shaish, realm of fire, earth, and life, and all that kind of stuff. And the reason I really like that is, first of all, it kind of blows up the whole kind of perspective of how a universe is really kind of meant to be in the real world in physics. You have these kind of like planes of existence almost. And they're sort of dedicated to these very elemental structures. And it harkens back to the original old world with the winds of magic. So those winds of magic, it's going to be a theme here in this video, but they kind of like come alive and sort of taken on their own form over the eons. And that's a kind of just a neat kind of perspective that I really like. The other thing I really like is the size of these. So each of them is like the size of probably, they kind of describe it sort of vaguely, but it's kind of like the size of a planet, but a really big planet. Because there's like edges of it there that they haven't really explored and that kind of thing. So it's this big, huge, like multi-continent type of planet or plane for each of the 8 different realms. And the reason I like that is because of how they're kind of doing it. So when they first kind of launched Age of Sigmar, it's really was just a lot of just open wasteland and a lot of just a giant playground for you to play in, to have your battles in, and now with the RPG to kind of have, you know, different role-playing settings in. But because of the size, it allows you to kind of do a couple of different approaches to kind of how you treat the game and how you treat the universe. So one example is they have the city of Hammerhall, and that has 1 foot in the realm of fire and 1 foot in the realm of life. And those are joined by kind of like a warp gate or a realm gate. And so that city actually exists in 2 almost entirely different planes of existence across 2 planets in a lot of ways. And there's commerce there, and there's a hub of trade and just interchange and cultural exchange across those 2 giant realms at this one main focal point. So there's a lot of detail about the city of Hammerhall and about just kind of the political structure and, you know, the kind of day-to-day life and all that kind of stuff. And that really is kind of almost the center of the universe narratively in a way for Age of Sigmar. Now there's certain other key points like the realm of Azir where Sigmar himself lives and stuff like that. And there's some good descriptions for that kind of thing. But kind of if you look at it as more of a human perspective, that main hub there, that kind of joining of those 2 realms in that one city, and that city is massive. I mean, it's bigger than you would even imagine. It's probably like 4 or 5 New York cities or something, you know. And there's a lot of detail there. But then as you sort of start to travel away from that place, as well as some other places, the descriptions get very vague. So you can either kind of treat this, you know, and kind of live and steep yourself in kind of the written down lore as they've presented it, or you can kind of step away from it and kind of go off on your own kind of thing, and it give you kind of the tools to kind of play with it and in the way that you want. And I think that's really, really neat. And I like that there's a lot of specificity that you can sort of latch yourself onto. It grounds the world or the multiple worlds, but there's enough kind of vagueness that's still left over from that initial launch, which I frankly really liked how the lore laid itself out, because to me it was kind of like they took the Odin tree, Thor, Viking mythology, and then mixed it with Mad Max and demons, and then it was just like this open wasteland of like these archetypes. And I thought it was a really interesting kind of concept. So they still kind of have that sort of breath, that initial breath of creation kind of throughout the realms that you can still kind of dip your toe into. And the interesting thing about the realms, getting back to the main point, is because each of the realms has a different archetype, a different sort of element, they get like this sort of very sci-fi edge to it. Not in the terms of like Star Wars or 40K or Star Trek, but it dips into that almost like Marvel universe sci-fi, where you have these strange cities. Like if you think of the Realm of Light, Haish, it just has a very bizarre outlook, and they're really just starting to sort of scratch the surface on that realm. Or if you think of like the Aidanathipkin, who are another elven race, the Lumineth realm lords are in the Haish realm, and then the Aidanathipkin are kind of like the underwater sea elves in a way. And the way that their sort of society works, think of kind of like an Aquaman type of vibe, if you've seen the Aquaman movie. Although different aesthetic, but it's that same kind of thing. So it has this strange, odd quality about it. And in a way, it is kind of like, you think of the Gungan underworld in the Phantom Menace, right? Separate your opinion of Phantom Menace out. But that sort of different sort of aesthetic is really, really neat. And so the world and the type of look that you're going for is going to be really different here with these different realms. And that's something I really appreciate. Anyway, so that's the number 5 there, the realms. Now, the number 4 here is actually going to be about the next video, and that is going to be actually the books. And when I talk about the books, I'm talking about the novels. And the books are really linked back to the last topic, which is the realms. So the thing I like about the books is it's only been about 5 or 6 years since they kind of launched the universe, but there's a ton of information out there. And so one of the knocks that the Age of Sigmar lore got from the beginning was kind of the reset of the lore and how there's no lore and I don't have anything to ground myself into and all that stuff. Well, there's been, in this short period of time, in my opinion, 5 years, just a vast amount of lore throughout battle tomes and rule books and narrative expansions, but also the novels specifically. And one thing that's been really cool, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow in the next video, is the unique characters and how, if you kind of take the 10,000 foot view of like what a Stormcast is, or what a Sylvaneth wood elf type of character is, or a chaos demon or something, you've got that sort of view, and you can kind of use that to latch on a loose hook and get into your gaming or whatever you're doing with the universe in that way. But the novels have, by and large, done a really good job of giving a personality, a character, a real life to a lot of these different types of archetypes that the game itself presents. And I think that's been very unique. There's been some of the novels that touch on like the regular folks, like what you and I might exist as a character in the realm, surrounded by, frankly, all of these superpowered, almost super heroic type of beings. Like you're surrounded by a bunch of X-Men and Avengers, basically. And so some of the stories have been told from that perspective of like the awe that you see when when the Stormcast walks in the room and that kind of stuff. So the other thing that the books have done a really nice job of is it's made me appreciate what's in the other types of tomes and rule books and all that stuff that much more, because I think they do, at least my impression of it is that they do such a tight job kind of tying all of their different sort of production aspects into play. Now, granted, there's going to be some like loopholes and stuff that they miss or whatever, great. But by and large, on the whole, I think it's done a really good job of making me appreciate like whatever army I've got here, and I'm playing more because now I've got that sort of grounded sense. So that's a nice thing. And it's I think maybe a lot of Warhammer players and 40K players maybe take that for granted. I'm not sure. Maybe D&D players might as well. But as somebody that's played like a lot of other games that have kind of a universe behind them, I can't tell you how much more engrossing and immersive it is to actually be in a universe that has some fleshing out. And I'm not one that's married to like canon. That's like the furthest thing from I don't give a crap about any of that. I'm willing to like break canon in half. But just because I have the detail is there for me to go and then, I guess you could say sort of smartly, or at least with intention, break canon and have a reason for it and have fun with that. And so having those books there and everything has been really good. And I didn't want to overlook that. Now, the other thing about that is, like I talked about in the realm, number 5 with the realms, was the tight narrative versus the open wasteland idea. And again, the books kind of do that. They give you that tight little narrative there, but they harken back to lots of sort of things like the Age of Myth and all that kind of stuff. So you can go and sort of scale your adventure or your battle or whatever you're doing in sort of the scope of it, kind of as you want to do it. You can have a real kind of localized event, that's, is a blip on the radar in terms of the history of the universe or whatever, or you can kind of pivot it a little bit more and have a little bit more of an epic or, monumental type of event going on with your gaming or whatever you're doing. So anyway, that's number 4. That's the books. Number 3, funnily enough, is the old world. And this feels very obvious to say, but as I was kind of trying to make a list here, I was like, I have to make this mention, because the fact that when they destroyed the old world and then made this new world, this Age of Sigmar, they didn't just make an entirely new game and forget completely the old world. They really are, the universe is really still attached to that old world universe. I mean, the very beginning really of Age of Sigmar is Age of Sigmar sort of clutching the last kernel of glowing life of that old world and kind of just floating through the abyss, through the void, until he meets Dracothian, and then the kind of things spin up from there, in a way. And so there's still a thread and a link back to that old universe, and I think that's very, very important, because it sets kind of in a way, kind of the expectations and all kind of like the level, or kind of like the level of a dimension. I don't want to get too philosophical here or physiological or whatever, but if you think of the first, second, third, and fourth dimension, and the fifth dimension, sixth dimension, I believe they think there's 10 or something if you get really rudimentary theoretical physics. But it kind of sets your expectation there, because you still has threads to what you could argue, and I would say I'd probably agree with you, was a more grounded, realistic type of world. Obviously was sort of an injected, like, punk rock Tolkien kind of vibe. I'm talking about the old world there. So you have a lot more grounding there, but you still have that thread to that grounded world with this sort of new universe. And really, I've found with the narrative recently that the Age of Sigmar, in a way, is almost like reinforming what happened in the old world in some ways. So you have kind of a more full sense of what some of these more higher level beings are, and sort of how people are and stuff like that. But the one concept that I find kind of interesting here, and I always kind of joke around with my friends if I want to be annoying, is I always say, well, okay, you know what Age of Sigmar is? It's actually the dreamscape of the Emperor in 40K, and what's going on in his brain while he's still barely clinging on to life and doing his like mental psychic battles in the warp. And the sort of concrete representation of that is what's going on in Age of Sigmar. That's silly, but I kind of think if you look at it from that perspective of and this gets a little bit biblical in a way, a very Western version of it anyway, is you have sort of the old world, which would be more like our Earth, right? And obviously it's magical and everything. It's not like our Earth. But then you have sort of the principalities in the firmament of the demons and the angels or whatever fighting. And the representation of that could be like the events in the Age of Sigmar side of it. So, because in a way, you kind of have sort of a more concrete, grounded type of reality, a very more physical and crude reality of the old world. But then you also can sort of, if you look, sort of peer under the bottom side of that, kind of rip away the veil of it, you have again the more abstract principalities that are fighting. And in this way, again, kind of tying back to the realms, you've got the 8 different realms with the 8 different elements, or the 8 different types of magic. And so it's a retelling of almost the same, not the same story, but the same kind of arc of good versus evil and all that kind of stuff. We'll get to more of that in a minute. But it's just a more hyper-realized, maybe 5th, 6th dimension kind of thing, where it's a little bit more pure energy, a little bit higher level magic. So I think that's an interesting kind of dichotomy there that's existing between those two universes, and the tension there is actually kind of an interesting concept. Like, you've got some characters that have carried through from the old world and so on. And because, again, circling back to my point, because the existence of the two are joined in a way, I just think it makes it that much more interesting. And to me, it makes both existences more interesting. And, we'll see when they reboot the old world here in probably about 2 years or so, how that kind of ties in and what kind of references will go back the other direction. I think that'll be kind of fascinating and interesting. So anyway, that's my number 3 there. And then my number 2, I will just kind of generally categorize as the grand alliances. So if you're not familiar, there's basically 4 grand alliances. There's order, there's chaos, there's destruction, and there's death. You notice there's no good and there's no evil, because a lot of the factions in the Order faction you could certainly classify as evil, because there are the Idoneth Deepkin who eat souls, and they don't care which souls they eat. They could be humans or dwarves or other elves and stuff like that. You have the Daughters of Cain, which are basically like a murder cult of elves, and very just nasty. But all of those factions on that Order side, the Sigmar faction, the free peoples that are organizing all the civilizations and the societies, which are made up of dwarves and other kinds of elves and humans, they are very much not chaos. Now, chaos gods are like, the principled dark side of everything. You've got the 4 chaos gods. One's like war and blood, and the other's like, Nurgle is the pestilence and the disease, and Slaanesh is like the god of lying in a way. I know it's the god of like excess, but it's really like the lie. It's like, look how great this is. Behind that is nightmare, And then you have Tzeentch, which is the god of just really the god of chaos, or change, they always call it. So you have order and chaos, and they're separated that way. And then there's destruction and death. But the reason I like the Grand Alliances is because good and evil is a little bit gray there in a lot of cases. Not in every case, I think. But I like that within the Grand Alliances, there is a hierarchy in a sense that, it's so, like, let's take death, for example. Death, but you could say the top of death is Nagash, okay? And he basically controls most of death. I wouldn't say he really controls all of death, because he's just ancient necromancer from the old world. And everybody that's sort of under his umbrella is telepathically and intrinsically linked to him forever, because once you kind of flip to Nagash's side, there's no coming back from that. And his eventual goal is like a cold stillness of entropy throughout the universe forever and ever, where he's basically everything and everything is him. But there's other sides of that death hierarchy that aren't really super happy about that also want their own little corners of power and stuff like that, and their own little corners of an afterlife where they can kind of exist in their own way that they want to exist. So there, even within that, you can almost say death is like actually more orderly than order. Within that that stark, cold, orderly hierarchy, there still is room for factions to have infighting and stuff like that. And you can just take that and go across each of the different alliances. And the way that you can sort of explain basically a battle between 2 factions within a single Grand Alliance, to me, has some of the more interesting narrative implications of the whole game. Because, okay, death faction fighting order faction, okay, that makes sense, right? Or, chaos fighting order. But within internally, you are starting to have, anyway, with these different narrative threads that they're starting to pull at, a lot more interesting kind of nuanced battles and disagreements, and just day-to-day types of conflict, which to me is actually a more human type of thing that you can get more engaged with. Because a lot of times our conflict in this life can be, certainly they can be conflict without nuance for sure, but there can also be a lot of conflict with nuance, which is the harder one to resolve. So I like that they've structured it in such a way to have these overall sort of canopies or limits, but the tension of sort of breaking out of those limits actually is a more interesting approach, I think, than what typically you might see with different races, like the elves versus the orcs versus the dwarves versus so it's less race driven, because at least on the Order side, all the races are mixed all the time. So you don't really see like one race versus another. Although, I wouldn't argue that a lot of the armies that you can do could be race-based, but a lot of them can be mixed-based as well. So I find that a lot more interesting and engaging. And the last sort of tidbit I will leave with that, with the Grand Alliances, is actually the races themselves are very, very invented. I could have put this in its own kind of category, but I wanted to sort of keep it in the same category. It's easier to count to 5 too than 6. But you take like the Idoneth Deepkin, right? They were created by Teclis, and then he didn't really like his creation, so he threw him aside, and he was going to actually murder all the Idoneth Deepkin that he made. And so now they're like a broken race of elves. and they actually, some of them have to actually go and like find souls to eat to live. So it's not like they're evil and they like enjoy eating souls. They actually have to do that to live. So this is super interesting. And so they live in like the darkest corners of the oceans of all the realms, and they have their own very elven sort of snooty society in a different way, but it's a little bit darker side. So instead of saying like a dark elf or a high elf, you know, it's its own thing. Like you can kind of call them an elf, you can kind of call them a race, but even within their own society, they have different races. They have the Namarti and the oh, I'm forgetting the other one. I'm having a brain fart. Namarti, or like the weak ones, and then the Morani or something. Gosh, I have an army of it. I can't remember the name. So yeah, that you have that sort of interesting thing. That's just a cool, different take on a race. It's something that you haven't really seen before. The other one I would mention is the Caradron Overlords. And you have two different kind of main dwarf factions, but you have dwarves across the realms. You have, you know, the Caradrons and the Fire Slayers, and you have the other ones that mix in with the Free People. So there's a lot of variety there within dwarves. And you have the Chaos Dwarves, the Legion of Asgore even. The Caradron are very cool because it's like, this is like capitalism, like gone crazy, you know, like exponentially. And it's like, who would have thought to do that in a kind of a fantasy universe where these guys are like, they have contracts, they have, you know, deals that are made, everything's a business related decision, everything's about profit and so on. And then how good and evil kind of plays within that race or within that sort of ethos is kind of an interesting side piece to that army or to that, you know, faction that you might want to play. And that just makes things so much more interesting than like, oh, there was a grudge between the dwarves and the elves in the ancient time. You know what I mean? Like you can Tolkienify everything, or you can make everything like Faerun or the Forgotten Realms or whatever, but they're really taking an interesting, innovative approach to a lot of these different factions and a lot of these different armies. Now, a lot of them, you know, I don't really like get into, like, just because it doesn't jive with me, but they're popular. Like I won't play Daughters of Cain ever, not because I like have a problem with it. It just doesn't speak to me. Or like a Slaanesh army or something like that. I wouldn't really get into that. But there's a lot of just different sort of funky changes, and they really do invest a lot of detail in a lot of these battle tomes and a lot of the lore books and everything for those different factions that fall under the Grand Alliances. So that's my number 2 there. And then finally, my number 1, and you'll see a lot of stuff that I talked about today in the other 2 videos, kind of as a recurring theme. But this one you'll definitely see some, and this is kind of like how soul works in Age of Sigmar and how death kind of works actually. So when you die, and I think that kind of goes back to what I said earlier, where magic is a prime force in this universe. So you have the different 8, you know, realms, the different 8 elements, types of magic. And that really is the most powerful force in this universe. It's not one of the gods. Like Sigmar is not the most powerful thing in the universe, or, you know, one of the chaos gods, or Archaon, who kind of is like the all 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in one person. You know, even though he might think he's the most powerful being in the universe, he's not. The most powerful thing in the universe is those magical forces that actually are so powerful in different parts of the realms that as you get further away from kind of like the center of the realms, it's like almost impossible to live because the magical energy is so intense there. Although the realm of Shaish is reversed because Nagash is a dummy and messed everything up. But you can read about that story later. But to me, so what became a very interesting thing after the 2nd edition of Age of Sigmar was which launched with the Soul Wars box set and the Soul Wars book. Souls became something that a lot of the gods were very interested in possessing and owning, which was a very interesting concept. So I'll try to sum this up quickly, but basically Nagash was very angry with Sigmar because his Stormcast Eternals that he constantly resurrects and who he snatched from the jaws of death before they died the first time are souls that are prevented from going to Nagash, and of course he wants all the souls because he is the big entropy god who wants just everything to be, you know, in sync with him. So they're basically fighting over souls, and they both want to own it, although Sigmar will tell you that he's about free will, I think. And the Chaos Gods obviously want your soul. They want you to just bow completely to, you know, whatever sort of base personification, you know, that they represent, like bloodlust or lust or, you know, disease and all this kind of stuff, or despair really is what Nurgle kind of seems to represent to me more than disease even. So you have these sort of fight for souls, and I think that's a very interesting concept to sort of think about in terms of a game, in terms of how the lore's working for the game as a kind of a backdrop, sort of a subsistence layer there, you kind of, you know, underneath the covers of the game. So that is a neat thing, I think, in terms of how, because, you know, what are these armies originally fighting for at the end of the day? Is it territory? Is it, you know, riches, or, you know, economic wealth or whatever? But no, they're really fighting over these beings and their souls, which is, you know, that's a little bit heavy, I think. But it's also kind of an interesting concept to sort of back everything with, because the gods, again, aren't the prime powerful beings. You know, your will, in a way, is detached from those beings. And really, like, who are those beings? You know, what created them? And so you have these get back to these kind of generic elements. So just the fact that like the universe here and the lore and stuff even addresses and it touches on that kind of thing, which I'll talk more about here in the next couple of videos, but that is just a neat kind of thing to sort of get sort of sidetracked off on as you go through some of the lore and stuff, because you've got, again, that varying sort of kaleidoscope of scopes. So you have the very micro level, the mundane, the day-to-day type of thing that you can have an event or a story or a battle or a skirmish or whatever. Then you can start to sort of explode that out. And so this universe in this game can kind of satisfy those different perspectives. If you want to play a larger scale type of thing where you're having this big war for, you know, the final soul battle of the universe or whatever, you can go to that thing, and, you know, you can play out your Age of Sigmar Book of Revelations nonsense. So you could get to that level. And it's an interesting sort of way to back a game with that kind of thing. And it makes it, the thing I like about it, I'll just kind of sum up with it, because I'm having a hard time talking about this, is it makes you sort of care for the characters a little bit more, because when somebody is like monkeying with your soul or with this character's soul, and like, I own it and you own it or whatever, it's like, well, whatever, guys, like, this guy owns his own soul. Let him do what he wants to do with it. You know what I mean? Like, it's the whole free will part of it is like, why it's not yours. You created this being, right? And this being now has this free will to do with what he wants. Why do you get to say, oh, I made you, now you get to have you back? And that's just, there's a lot of just implications in that generally. And it's just like, you know, I'm like, am I reading a book about a game? What is this? You know, like, like, why are they going there? But it just makes everything just that much more interesting. And it really gives a lot more reality and sort of fundamentals in a way to the rest of the universe. So yeah, this is kind of a weird way to end it, but I definitely recommend folks, you know, if you're watching this video, you probably already play the game or into it. But if you're not into it and you're just like, what do you think about Age of Sigmar lore? Like, cool, thanks for watching, you know, but, you know, go watch some battle reports. But it's a fun game anyway. But it has this other kind of just massive amounts of lore that they've developed over the last 5 or 6 years. And for such a young game compared to like Dungeons and Dragons or 40K or something, or the old world, there's just really a lot of interesting stuff going on, kind of buried away in some of these different battle tomes and novels and things like that. So anyway, thanks.